Welcome to a journey through time, where history isn't just a memory, but a vivid landscape of events and emotions waiting to be explored anew. You're standing at the edge of a medieval garden, but this isn't the lush palace courtyard you might picture. It's more of a rustic, hand-dug patch behind a thatched cottage, humming with bees and buzzing with flies. The smell ripe, almost overwhelmingly ripe. Because this garden's secret ingredient, its secret weapon, is the thing your modern self tries not to think about manure. Not the neat store-bought kind in tidy plastic sacks. Oh no. We're talking raw, unfiltered animal dung. Cow, horse, pig, if it pooped, it probably got shoveled into a cart and flung joyfully across the soil. The medieval gardener didn't have Miracle Grow. Instead, they had a very keen appreciation for what came out of the back end of their livestock. It wasn't just spread, it was worked lovingly, forked into the earth by hand, with dung forks carved from ash or elderwood. You might pause here, blinking in disbelief, as a peasant woman in a coarse woolen tunic hums to herself while shoveling a mix of cow droppings and ash into her carrot bed. She's not grossed out. This for her is treasure. And the smells, well, they weren't optional. The scent of fermenting manure mingled with rotting cabbage leaves and kitchen scraps and what they called the middens, a sort of compost pile meets garbage heap, squatting at the edge of every hamlet. And if you were especially lucky, the wind would carry a waft of pigsty just as you leaned in to pluck a turnip. Still, it worked. Historians still argue whether medieval composting techniques were instinctual or inherited from Roman and Arab agricultural treatises, but the results speak for themselves. Even with primitive tools and no refrigeration, medieval peasants could coax remarkably productive yields from overworked fields using nothing but dung ash and grit. Here's a little-known tidbit. Fresh manure was too hot for most crops. It could scorch seedlings and kill roots if applied directly. So the smarter gardeners let it sit for months, sometimes buried, sometimes just heaped until it mellowed into a rich, crumbly black gold. They didn't use thermometers, of course. Instead, they'd poke a stick into the pile, then press it to their lips. If it burned too hot, if warm and sweet-smelling, well Swedish, then it was ready. Even urine had its uses. Human urine, especially from men for whatever reason, was considered excellent for soaking stubborn seeds like parsnips and leeks to wake them from dormancy. You'd leave a bucket by the garden gate with a sign, probably just a carved symbol, and everyone passing by would do their part. Morning urine was best, they believed, for its clarity and strength. That's right. Your entire village could be part of your fertilizer system. You're not imagining it. Medieval gardening was in many ways a community bodily function. Of course, there were mistakes. You weren't supposed to use dog or pig manure, too unclean and often too acidic. But sometimes the line between smart composting and biohazard was thin. One tale from a 14th century manor tells of a tenant farmer who tried to impress his lord by carting in waste from the local tanner's pit. The crops grew big, but so did the number of people with stomach cramps. Still, for all its hazards, dung was democratically available. Rich and poor alike depended on it, and castles had entire teams to manage the stables and mucking schedules. Imagine being the apprentice to the dung master rising before dawn to inspect manure quality. Prestige not quite, necessary absolutely. Necessary. But perhaps the strangest use of animal waste wasn't in the garden itself, but in guarding it. Dried cow pats were stacked as walls mixed with straw and mud to create barriers against wind and rabbits. They crumbled less than you'd expect, and if a thief tried to raid your lettuces at night, a well-placed kick to the cow pat wall might collapse something very smelly on top of them. You try to step lightly around the edges of this imagined plot. Now the scent curling up your nose, the air earthy and rich with unseen life. It's hard not to admire the grit of people who didn't see excrement as waste but as opportunity. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to post your location and local time. I love seeing where and when you're tuning in from. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You look up and the sun's just touching the treetops, golden light filtering through the tangled vines of a centuries-old hedgerow. Somewhere nearby a donkey brays. Probably stepped in something. You've just wiped your boots mentally, if not literally, after stepping through a medieval compost zone. But now your gaze drifts upward to the soft glow of the moon cresting over the edge of a low wattle fence. That's not just ambiance, it's a celestial calendar. Because here's the thing medieval gardeners didn't plant by the season alone. They planted by the moon. Waning, waxing full and new, each phase supposedly held sway over what could thrive in your soil. And no, this wasn't fringe superstition muttered by toothless crones in the woods. This was common knowledge passed from abbots to apprentices scribbled in marginalia beside Latin prayers and cabbage-growing diagrams. You crouch beside a patch of soil recently tilled into perfect little furrows. The old gardener beside you, his beard stiff with ash and wisdom, waves a crooked finger toward the sky. Never sow root crops during a waxing moon, he mutters. They'll bolt. And you nod sagely even though you have no idea what bolt means yet. Historians still argue whether these lunar gardening practices were truly effective or just clever coincidence wrapped in ritual. But when enough generations see their turnips flourish only under certain stars, you stop asking questions. You just start checking the sky. There were calendars, beautifully illuminated ones, sometimes bound in sheepskin, that listed what to do week by week, aligned with moon cycles and saints' days. Saint Isidore for tilling Saint Fiacre, for sowing Saint Medard to pray it wouldn't rain too much. And, oh yes, never ever plant beans on a Friday. That was just bad luck. No one quite agreed on why, but after a few crop failures, you didn't need a reason. One of the more curious tips: plant leeks and onions during the dark of the moon, the 3 days before the new moon appears, because that's when their soul travels deeper into the soil. Sound like nonsense, perhaps? But science now tells us plant growth is influenced by lunar gravity and sap cycles. So maybe those monks knew a thing or two we've forgotten. There was a fringe belief that the moon didn't just influence growth, it watched. Some gardeners turned the faces of their scarecrows toward it as a sign of respect. Others covered their seedlings at night, worried that too much moonlight might spoil their character. You chuckle at that as you brush a cobweb from a gourd vine, but a part of you can't help glancing at the moon just to check. Want another fun tidbit? Some planting advice wasn't about light at all, but about the position of the moon in the zodiac. Yep, lunar astrology for vegetables. Aries was good for peppers. Pisces absolutely not. A book from 1420 earnestly warned, set not thy lentils under the twins, lest they split before sprouting. Of course, this was more accessible to monasteries and noble households. Peasants might not have owned a calendar at all. But even in tiny villages, old women watched the sky and gave planting advice with the confidence of seasoned astrologers. Wait till the moon blushes, one might whisper, referring to the faint red glow of a lunar eclipse. That's when you sow peas for the sweetest pods. You blink, surprised by how specific that is. Who knew peas had a lunar sweet spot? And yes, there were failures. Sometimes the moon said plant, and then it hailed the next morning. Or a goat broke into the garden and made philosophical musings about astrology feel pointless. Still, belief persisted. Back then, gardening wasn't just seasonal, it was spiritual, celestial, and occasionally absurd. You can picture it now, a friar with a twisted hip consulting both the Psalter and the moon chart before sowing lettuce. One eye on heaven, one eye on the dirt. Even the tools they used mirrored this rhythm. The hoe was crescent-shaped, not just for scooping, but to echo the moon. Some believed using a full moon-shaped tool during the waxing phase could encourage growth. A scholar in 1397 scoffed at this writing. The moon does not care for tools. But then again, he also claimed bees were born from ox carcasses. Back in the garden, a soft wind rustles the leaves of a young apple tree. You reach up and pluck one of its tiny sour fruits, still weeks away from ripening. The gardener smacks your hand gently. Not yet, he grumbles. Moon's not ready. You smile and let it drop back into the grass. Your fingers are still tingling slightly from that slap on the hand, gentle but firm, a medieval reminder that nature has her schedule and humans had best respect it. But before you wander off too far in the moonlight, your eyes catch the glint of metal, dull and dark, with age leaning against a tree stump. It's long-handled, curved, just so, and unmistakably used. That, dear listener, is a dung fork. Not exactly glamorous, you think. But in the world of medieval gardening, this was the Swiss Army knife of tools. If the hoe was the elegant dancer, the dung fork was the brawler, sturdy, brutish, and utterly essential. Peasants wielded them like warriors because, honestly, shoveling literal tons of muck required something approaching valor. And yes, if you squint, you can just make out the faint whirls where a blacksmith once hammered the iron tines into shape, twisting them slightly for strength. No mass production here, each fork a unique, if slightly smelly masterpiece. One of the more overlooked facts in historical records is just how customized these tools became. Some had 4 tines, others 6. Some were narrow, designed for poking between root beds, while broader ones could scoop a full load of straw-mixed manure from a barn floor in a single grunt. The ash or elm wood handle might have been soaked in linseed oil if you were fancy, or just rubbed down with animal fat to keep it from splitting. You grip the air reflexively as if holding it now, and yes, it's heavier than you imagined. Historians still argue whether the dung fork was first forged for agricultural use or adapted from older war tools. After all, the basic shape isn't far off from some battlefield polearms, and given how fiercely medieval peasants defended their land, tools often became weapons. There's even a record from the 1300s of a particularly heated land dispute in Lincolnshire, ending with a scuffle that involved a dung fork, 3 missing teeth, and 1 severely trampled leek bed. More fringe, yet charmingly plausible. Some gardeners would carve little charms into their tool handles. Tiny crosses, runes, a heart or an eye to see pests before they came. One rather eccentric monk even reportedly named his dung fork Mildred, and kept it wrapped in wool when not in use so she wouldn't get cold. Was Mildred a metaphor or just a well-loved manure companion? We'll never know. You hear the creak of a wheelbarrow nearby, though in truth it's less of a wheelbarrow and more of a clunky wooden cart with a wobbling, iron-rimmed wheel. A girl of about 12 is pushing it with effort, gritting her teeth as it lurches sideways. Inside a mound of sodden hay and, yes, more dung. The smell wafts on the breeze like a gentle slap. She doesn't flinch. You wouldn't either, not after the first few weeks. Let's not forget the role of children in all this. Medieval gardening wasn't some bucolic pastime. It was an all-hands-on-deck survival mechanism. And young hands, though smaller, were often tasked with the stinkiest jobs, forking middens, dumping chamber pots, even turning compost with bare feet. Yes, you heard that right, bare feet. It was believed to earth the body and stir the life in the soil. Today we'd call that a health hazard. Back then, just part of Tuesday. But the dung fork wasn't just for manure. It turned mulch, shifted rotting leaves, aerated beds, and even helped mix in precious extras like wood ash or crushed oyster shell. A few clever households even passed their forks down like heirlooms. Imagine receiving your grandfather's dung fork on your wedding day, complete with a carved handle and probably residual aroma. There's something comforting in that level of practicality. No batteries, no motors, just muscle wood and iron coaxing food from the earth, one forkful at a time. The rhythm of work was its own kind of meditation, and while your modern brain might recoil at the idea of hand-tilling a cabbage row using something that smells faintly of sheep backside, part of you admires it. Simpler, yes. Easier, not even close. And sometimes those forks told their own stories. One museum in Germany holds a dung fork believed to have belonged to a 15th century gardener poet. The tines are etched with lines of verse barely visible unless caught in the right light. May this fork feed thee well, though its scent resemble hell. Poetic questionable, honest extremely. Even monks with all their copied scriptures and quiet contemplation revered the dung fork. In many monastic gardens, the tool was blessed annually sprinkled with holy water, alongside the spades and scythes. Because if your job was to grow food to feed a dozen silent, hungry men, you wanted every blessing you could get. The wind picks up again, rattling a few dry seed pods still clinging to their stalks. You glance at the tool once more before moving on, imagining the hands that wielded it, the backs bent. The sweat poured the satisfaction of turning rot into life. And just as you're walking away, you spot another oddity leaning beside a low stone wall, this one shorter, more curved. But that, dear listener, is a tale for another section. As you stroll farther along the edge of this time-worn garden, the air shifts lighter, now tinged not with dung, but the faint aroma of crushed mint and chamomile. You pass beneath a crooked arch of woven willow, the gateway to a different kind of battlefield. Because while manure helped things grow, another constant threat needed just as much attention, pests. And not just the buzzing, nibbling kind you're talking, rabbits, crows, caterpillars, and the occasional wandering goose. This is where things get creative. Standing vigil in the middle of a raised bed is what looks like a scarecrow, though perhaps scarecrow is too generous a term. Its arms are bundles of twigs, its robe a cast-off monk's habit, stuffed with straw, and its head a hollowed gourd with two mismatched buttons for eyes. One has a crude smile carved into it, friendly but unsettling. You pause half expecting it to wave. This was standard practice homemade scarecrows propped up to mimic humans and confuse the birds. Sometimes they wore hats or held sticks to resemble weapons, and if you were especially unlucky, you might be drafted to sit beside one and throw pebbles every time a blackbird got too curious. Monks, believe it or not, were the earliest record keepers of scarecrow efficacy. One 12th century text noted Brother Thomas's dummy in the parsnips frightens more than his sermons. But scarecrows were just the beginning. Medieval gardeners had a remarkable and sometimes absurd arsenal of pest repellents. Owl effigies carved from bark were placed in trees complete with feathered cloaks, made from scavenged bird wings. Some even strung up fish bones to clatter in the wind, to rattle the weasels, as one French peasant wrote. It probably didn't work, but it made them feel better. And then there was human hair. Yes, hair. cut from the heads of family members swept up from the floor of the village barber, even begged from the local nunnery. It was stuffed into cloth pouches and hung from poles around the garden. Why supposedly the smell warned animals away, signaling the presence of humans? A bit eerie, yes, but not as eerie as the fringe practice of using hair soaked in vinegar and wrapped around garlic cloves. That one was meant to drive off both rabbits and spirits. Two birds, one reeking stone. Historians still argue whether these repellents were effective or simply ritualistic. But for every magic solution, there was usually a practical shadow behind it. Take the ringing bells often attached to strings running through the hedgerows. The wind would blow, the bells would tinkle, and birds would scatter most of the time. You'd get used to the sound, a soft metallic chime that became part of daily life like the creak of the well or the coughing of the blacksmith's apprentice. Let's not forget the cats. Every garden needed at least one, usually more. Not cuddly lap cats, mind you. These were wiry, sharp-eyed, mouse-slaying dynamos. Some were semi-feral, living in sheds or barn lofts, and paid in leftover stew bones. You'd see them dart between rows of beans' eyes trained on the slightest rustle. One particularly famous cat named Malkin appears in several estate ledgers from Yorkshire, paid annually in milk for her services rendered to the cabbage patch. We assume this was mice, not curses. More unusual still, some gardeners swore by planting specific decoy plants to lure pests away, like sowing a sacrificial bed of lettuce far from the main garden, hoping the slugs would feast there instead. Others smeared honey on flat rocks, which attracted ants and kept them busy. You imagine that one was messy, possibly sticky. Then there was the truly strange one record from a Bavarian village describes a gardener who smeared the borders of his bean field with mashed sardines and ash. The idea was to attract scavenging birds that would then eat the insects. It reportedly worked, but no one wanted to visit. Perhaps the most charming of these techniques was the use of children singing. Yes, really. Some gardeners believed cheerful noise, especially high-pitched voices, would confuse or frighten small mammals. Groups of children were invited or bribed to sit on the garden edges and sing nursery rhymes, bang spoons, or clap. It sounds adorable until you realize this often happened at sunrise. And the fringe methods. Oh, they get better. There were whispered tales of burying a frog at the four corners of a field to form a living ward, or painting angry faces on flat stones and placing them in the soil to stare up at invaders. One particularly bold tale tells of a woman who swore that whispering threats to your beans each morning made them grow faster out of fear. That one's harder to verify. But like much of medieval life gardening was part science, part superstition, and part deeply personal ritual. You didn't just throw seeds in the ground and hope. You walked the rows each day, you whispered prayers or threats. You placed your bundles of rosemary under the gatepost for luck, and you listened to the birds, the wind, even the insects. You lean against the fence, now listening as a faint bell tinkles in the breeze. The scarecrow's robe flutters slightly, and for a moment it feels like it's watching. But then a cat streaks past chasing something unseen, and you remember this garden doesn't sleep. It watches, it listens, it defends itself with hair bones and song. And maybe, just maybe, it remembers. The garden quiets again as the last bell chime fades into dusk. The scarecrow stands stiffly, its gourd head now just a silhouette against the purpling sky. But you naturally aren't done wandering. Your feet crunch gently on gravel as you follow a narrow path, winding past rosemary and chives until it leads you to a low stone bench tucked beneath a yew tree. And sitting there is something even stranger than a fishbone bird ward or a scarecrow named Mildred. A monk, bald barefoot and humming, has his eyes closed, his hands hovering just above a patch of thyme. He isn't touching it, just listening, maybe blessing it. You edge closer. He begins to whisper not to you but to the plants. Welcome to the bizarre and beautiful world of plant talking. Now, modern science hasn't exactly endorsed the idea that chatting with your basil improves its flavor, but medieval gardeners, they were all in, especially monks. Many believed that certain herbs responded better if sung to, prayed over, or even gently scolded. This wasn't simply romanticism. It was tied to a belief system where everything plants. People, birds, even the soil had a soul or spirit. And if you wanted your thyme to grow bushy, you had to speak to its essence. Casually tell it your secrets. Or recite the Lord's Prayer backward while planting it under a waxing moon. Naturally, historians still argue whether these sound-based rituals originated from Christian monasticism or much older pagan practices folded quietly into cloistered life like herbs into a broth. But the fact remains, medieval texts are full of oddly specific sound rituals for the garden. Chanting while watering parsley, humming during harvest, silence during weeding. Yes, silence. One old Flemish guide insists that pulling weeds whilst gossiping turns thine carrots bitter. So don't say you weren't warned. Monastic herb gardens were hotbeds, pun intended, of sonic experimentation. Gregorian chants weren't just for chapel. They floated out over lavender rows and onto leek beds. Some monks believed harmonizing with nature helped restore cosmic balance. Others just liked the acoustics. Either way, their herbs flourished. Let's talk about that fringe theory involving tuning forks. There's a marginal sketch in a 14th century manuscript, probably made by a bored scribe, that shows a friar striking a small metal fork near a pot of sage. The caption reads thus: "The hum wakens her." Was it serious, maybe? Or maybe the friar was just lonely. Gardening is, after all, a solitary pursuit. And don't overlook the sound of bells, not the pest-scaring ones, but smaller, softer bells tied to herb bundles. It was believed that when gently rung, these summoned helpful spirits or fairies. Some took it a step further, claiming rosemary retained sound memories like a fragrant, leafy cassette tape. Whisper a prayer into the leaves, and when you steep it later in wine or bathwater, the prayer would release. Aromatherapy meets voice memo. Quirky tidbit: certain plants had taboo phrases. Saying the Latin name of deadly nightshade aloud in a garden was believed to cause basil to wilt. Yes, basil was apparently that sensitive. This may have originated as a monkish prank, but records show gardeners genuinely avoiding certain words for fear of spoiling entire plots. And while monks had the time for incantations, peasants found more practical ways to speak to their gardens. A rhythmic stomp along the beds, whistling, clicking stones together in patterns passed down like folk songs. You picture it now: a weathered farmer clicking two smooth river pebbles together as she inspects her beans, each tap as familiar as breath. One charming example comes from a Scottish crofter who named each of his herb rows and greeted them daily like children. "How's young pennyroyal today?" he'd say, still cross with chamomile. His neighbors thought him mad until his herbs were the envy of 3 counties. And let's not forget the children again. Singing in the garden wasn't just to scare rabbits. It was believed that a child's voice encouraged plants to grow faster, lighter, brighter. So if you had 3 spare children, they might be lined up between the beet rows, humming a clumsy rendition of Greensleeves to the lettuce. Try not to giggle. It's sweet in its own slightly deranged way. Modern science, as it turns out, does support the idea that sound vibrations can affect plant behavior. Certain frequencies can stimulate germination or root development. So maybe that old monk wasn't so off key after all. You watch now as the monk on the bench finishes his whispering. He smiles at the time. No, really, he smiles at it, then reaches into his robe and pulls out a tiny cracked clay pot. He scoops a pinch of dirt from the time bed and places it reverently inside. A relic, a backup planting. Maybe he's just sentimental. Or maybe in his world that bit of time now contains a little song, a prayer, and a promise. The garden glows softly in the last light. You hear nothing now but the wind through the yew and the faint, sustained hum of a single note still hanging in the air. You hum back instinctively. The time doesn't respond. Or does it? You hum again, this time under your breath, as the scent of crushed time lingers on your fingers. The monk has padded away quietly into the dusk, leaving behind only the echo of his song and that odd cracked pot tucked neatly beneath the yew. You press on the stone path leading you around a bend where the garden opens up into a wide rectangle, its beds framed by low woven fences and strange steaming mounds near the far wall. They look like piles of rotting straw, dark, moist humming with flies and glowing faintly in the moonlight. But these aren't just compost heaps. No, these are blessed, literally. Because in certain monastic gardens and even a few particularly devout peasant plots, compost was more than just decomposing kitchen waste and barn sweepings. It was the subject of prayers, invocations, and, depending on the region, actual spells. You've now entered the sacred and slightly smelly world of compost magic. It sounds silly now, but consider the logic of it. In a time when crop failure meant starvation, and when the health of the soil could determine your family's fate, you didn't leave things to chance, or just worms. You called in help from saint spirits or anything that might lend a hand. The most famous name here, Saint Fiacre, the patron saint of gardeners. A 7th century Irish monk with a suspiciously green thumb, he was said to grow medicinal plants faster than a normal man could sneeze. He became so associated with miraculous gardening that by the late medieval period, many compost heaps bore his name. Fiacre's bed, they called them. And some even erected little shrines beside them, half-rotten wood carvings stuck into the top of the pile, looking a bit like very moldy garden gnomes. It's said that before layering a compost heap, you were to sprinkle each layer of waste vegetable peels, straw manure with a bit of holy water, and recite a brief prayer. Something like, "By thy grace let this rot swift and true, and let no devil take the worms." Charming. Smelly. Effective historians still argue whether these rituals had more to do with sanitation or symbolism, but no medieval gardener worth their leeks dared skip them. And yes, spells. Fringe, of course, and often whispered only when no priest was around. One 14th century grimoire recommends adding a silver coin to the bottom of your compost pile to sweeten the spirits within. Another suggests placing a lock of red hair into the heap to summon the heat of Mars for faster decay. Whether this was astrology witchcraft or just plain weird, it was taken seriously in some circles, especially in isolated rural communities. A lesser-known tidbit. Some monks chanted psalms directly over the compost. Psalm 104 was a favorite: "He causeth the grass to grow for the cattle and herb, for the service of man." Recited slowly, rhythmically, while turning the heap with a fork. Imagine a row of brown-robed figures humming to piles of steaming vegetable rot. Monastery life equal parts sacred and surreal. And while most compost was passive, left to decay over months, some gardeners practiced hot composting, an early form of what we now call thermophilic composting. They didn't know the science, but they knew that a properly layered heap moistened and turned would heat up enough to bake a potato. Literally. There's a record of a nun at Fontevraud Abbey who used her compost pile as an outdoor oven, wrapping root vegetables in cabbage leaves and burying them till noonday bell. Apparently, they came out soft, hot, and oddly earthy. You'll stick to a microwave, but admit it, you're intrigued. Of course, compost wasn't always spiritual. In poorer communities, the heap was just a heap, sometimes kept behind a barn, sometimes right under the outhouse. Yes, medieval outhouses often doubled as compost stations. Waste not want, not especially if you wanted impressive beans. In larger estates, though, compost was carefully managed. Layers of hay ash manure and food waste were built like lasagna. Gardeners kept journals tracking when each pile was cooked and ready. Some even boasted of their compost quality like vintners with wine. The March heap is mellow, one lord wrote in 1383, yet the February stack steams with sweet rot, and shall nourish the lettuces grandly. And then there was the social side. In towns, some neighborhoods had communal compost heaps, gathering spots where scraps gossip, and occasionally romantic glances were exchanged. Imagine flirting over turnip peels and eggshells. Somehow it happened. One particularly whimsical tale comes from southern France, where a young woman won her husband's heart by giving him a basket of her finest wrought as a dowry gift. The marriage contract even included her rights to one-third of his future compost output. Romance medieval style. As you approach the steaming heap in front of you now, a light mist rises from its center. The smell is intense, pungent, complex, almost dignified. This is no mere garbage pile, this is living history. Beneath your feet, billions of microbes churn and feast, transforming yesterday's table scraps and sheep droppings into the black gold that fed generations. You take a step back, giving the compost its space. The little shrine to Saint-Fiacre leans slightly, his wooden face worn and cracked, but somehow still serene. His tiny carved hand holds a hoe, or maybe a turnip. It's hard to tell anymore. Above you, the stars emerge slowly one by one, and the compost steams quietly into the night. Holy rot. Blessed decay. Not bad for a pile of leftovers. You step lightly past the compost mounds, now the warmth lingering at your heels. Ahead, the garden narrows again, hedged in by crumbling stone walls and woven fencing, almost secretive. But this is no ordinary patch of soil. This is where form meets function, where the practical mingles with the poetic, and where peasants and monks alike planted with purpose. Welcome to the pottage garden, the medieval multi-tool of horticulture. You've seen big castle gardens and sprawling monastic herb plots, but the pottage garden is smaller, scrappier, and somehow smarter. Imagine a single rectangle of land, perhaps 10 feet by 20, divided not by neat borders but by need. Here, thyme grows next to cabbages, onions twist around berry brambles, and beans climb right up the stems of sunflowers. Nothing here is planted for looks. Everything has a job. In medieval times, pottage referred to the thick, bubbling stew that fed most of the population twice a day if you were lucky once, if not. It was made with whatever could be grown, chopped, boiled, and stretched over coals. So naturally, the garden that supported it had to be packed, layered, and relentless. Historians still argue whether pottage gardens were a deliberate system or simply a byproduct of necessity. But what's clear is that they functioned as early versions of what modern gardeners now call polyculture or permaculture. Every inch of soil was maximized. Shade-loving herbs huddled under leafy brassicas. Climbing peas used staked kale stalks as ladders. Nasturtiums sprawled everywhere, not just for color, but to attract aphids away from more precious greens. Here's a quirky tidbit: some gardeners believed planting leeks beside lettuce made the lettuce sweeter. Others swore that radishes hated onions and should never share a bed. Whether fact or folklore, these companion planting superstitions shaped garden layouts for centuries. You might smirk now, but if your winter dinner depended on your cabbage not being offended by your turnips, you'd be cautious too. Wander through this patch and you'll see layers literally. Root vegetables below, leafy greens above, beans rising skyward, and scattered throughout plants that pulled double-duty marigolds to deter insects garlic, to ward off both illness and garden thieves, and mint? Well, mint went wherever it wanted, still does. You pause beside a cluster of broad beans tangled with borage. A peasant boy kneels beside them, muttering something and tossing crushed eggshells into the soil. That's another clever trick. Medieval gardeners often used shell's ash and even broken pottery shards to adjust soil pH. Did they know the chemistry? Probably not. But when the plant looked happier, they remembered the method. At the far edge, a trellis leans built from willow branches bound with wool yarn. Peas spiral upward, their tendrils curling with eerie intention. One bean pod rattles slightly in the breeze as if whispering its readiness. This vertical gardening wasn't just clever, it was crucial. When your garden is barely larger than a bedroll, you go up, not out. And let's not forget the medicinal layer. Hidden among the stew makers were the healer's comfrey for poultices, yarrow for wounds, fennel for digestion. Some gardens were arranged like invisible apothecaries. Cooks knew which green would settle a sick child's belly, which flower could help a fever. The garden fed the body, yes, but also soothed it. Here's another fringe favorite. Some pottage gardens had spirit corners. Little nooks planted with wildflowers, untouched herbs, or simply left fallow. These were offerings to the land spaces never harvested, meant for whatever spirits might be watching. A sort of botanical bribe. One account from 13th century Cornwall mentions a woman who left bits of bread and honey in her garden's spirit corner, lest the beans grow bitter from jealousy. Of course, not every garden looked like this. Wealthier estates had separate spaces for herbs, vegetables, and flowers, but the pottage garden, humble, chaotic, and fiercely efficient, was where real life happened. This is where the food came from. Not for feast, but for survival. You crouch now and run your fingers through the soil. It's warm, rich, and slightly gritty with crushed shell. A sprig of parsley waves lazily near your knee, and a single worm wriggles deeper into the dark. The garden is alive, pulsing with effort and memory. You feel a strange gratitude toward it. In the distance, a woman calls out time for the evening stew. You imagine her ladling thick, garlicky pottage into wooden bowls, flavored with charred lentils, maybe even a hint of marjoram. It's not much, but it's enough. And behind every spoonful, this patch of soil. This tangled, blessed mess of leaves and roots. You rise brushing the earth from your palms. No monoculture. No grid. Just necessity, wisdom, and the quiet miracle of growing your next meal in a few square feet of dirt. You dust your hands and keep walking past the edge of the pottage plot, where the well-worn paths grow narrow and the fencing fades away. Here the plants seem a bit wilder, the weeds are taller. But before you pull anything, take a closer look, because what you might think is an intruder was once dinner. Welcome to the misunderstood world of medieval weeds, except they weren't always called that. Goosefoot fathen, nettles chickweed. All the names you might associate with something to yank out and toss away were in fact staples in the medieval kitchen. And sometimes in the medicine chest. You stop beside a thicket of what looks like an unruly mess of broad-leaved greens. A man in a leather tunic stoops and pinches off a handful, tossing them into the basket on his hip. That's not a weed, he tells you proudly. That's fat hen, also called lamb's quarters. Boiled and salted, it served as a spinach substitute long before spinach got its publicist. Historians still argue whether peasants considered these plants proper food or just desperation fare. But evidence from manorial records and even monastic kitchen logs shows that so-called weeds often showed up on the table, especially during lean months. Why plant what already grows for free? You crouch beside a patch of goosefoot, its serrated leaves dusty but vibrant. It thrives in poor soil, barely needs water, and reseeds itself with wild enthusiasm. Sounds like a gardener's dream. And the seeds ground into flour when grain was scarce? Not ideal, but in the depth of winter your stomach didn't care. Quirky tidbit chickweed was called poor man's salad. Eaten raw, it added a nutty crunch to stews. Nettles, though infamous for their sting, were boiled into a vitamin-rich soup, provided you pluck them with gloves or heroic stubbornness. Some recipes even mixed nettles with oats and goat milk to make a sort of mushy pudding. You wouldn't see it on a royal menu, but it kept people alive. And then there's the herbal lore. Take self-heal, a scraggly little bloom, found in nearly every patch of neglected soil. It was believed to cure sore throats, ulcers, and heartbreak. Whether it worked is unclear, but enough people believed in its power that it gained names like Carpenter's Herb and Heal-All. Makes your packet of ibuprofen look kinda boring. You pause by a clump of cleavers, their Velcro-like stems clinging to your sleeves. These were used in rudimentary filtering systems, tied in bundles and shoved into jugs to strain water. They were also boiled and fed to sheep to sweeten the milk, though whether the sheep agreed is uncertain. And speaking of animals, many of these wild greens served double duty. Chickens loved chickweed, pigs adored burdock root, and more than one medieval child was sent into the field with a basket and a firm reminder, if you can't eat it, at least the cow can. But here's the fringe part. Some believed certain weeds only grew where spirits had walked. Plantain, for example, was said to appear in the footsteps of saints or fairies, depending on which side of the border you lived. One 15th century Welsh gardener insisted that harvesting it without saying a charm would lead to a garden full of shadows. Creepy, yes, but oddly poetic. Weeds were also classified by their willingness to show up. A freshly cleared plot that sprouted mallow was considered lucky. But if thistle arrived first, that meant trouble. You could ask the local wise woman to bless the soil, or you could wait it out. Either way, your relationship with weeds was more like a negotiation than a battle. And in city gardens, tiny rooftop plots or boxes by the window, some of these weeds were intentionally encouraged. Urban dwellers might plant nettles or dandelions in pots alongside cabbage or leeks, not just for the nutritional value, but because these scrappy greens didn't mind the smoke, soot, and pigeons. Dandelions, by the way, were a star. Leaves for salad, flowers for wine, roots for a bitter digestive tea. A whole pharmacy in one cheerful yellow bloom. They weren't weeds, they were tools. You're beginning to get the sense that weed wasn't a word that meant unwanted. It simply meant unexpected. And sometimes the unexpected was exactly what you needed. Especially when the beans failed, the barley came up stunted, or late frost ruined the lettuce. That patch of chickweed suddenly looked like a miracle. You rise again, brushing the dried seeds from your knees, and take in the rougher side of the garden with new eyes. This wasn't neglect. This was insurance. A backup pantry written in green, and just beyond the edge a crone with a crooked back and a basket on her arm bends low, murmuring to a clump of nettles. She plucks them with care, tucks them beside a few spring onions, and glances your way. You half expect her to wink, and maybe she does. The air feels thicker now, not heavy exactly, but rich, alive, like the soil itself is exhaling. You follow a sunken path between low rows of sorrel and late cabbage, and there beside a battered wooden gate stands a bucket. Not an especially impressive one. It's wooden iron bound and about halfway full of something pale yellow and suspiciously warm. You don't need to ask. You already know. This is the urine bucket. Go ahead, laugh. You're allowed. But don't dismiss it too quickly because what seems revolting to you was once an essential part of the medieval garden toolkit. Human urine, yes, that very thing was prized as a fertilizer, a stain remover, and even a pest repellent. In some households, it was collected with the same care you might give your heirloom tomatoes. And it wasn't just a household chore. In many towns and manors, there were rules, actual regulations about where and how you relieved yourself if you wanted your contribution to go to good use. Morning urine in particular was considered strongest, probably because it had been stewing all night in the bladder. Delicious. Historians still argue whether this practice came from inherited Roman agricultural techniques or emerged independently across Europe. Either way, by the 14th century, urine collection was normalized. Some gardeners had designated chamber pots just for garden use, emptied daily into a barrel that was kept near the compost pile or tucked behind the privy. Quirky tidbit urine was often mixed with wood ash to create an early form of liquid gold fertilizer, sometimes referred to in old texts as lant. Sweet lant, if you please. The ammonia helped break down organic material while the potassium and nitrogen gave plants a boost. Some even boiled it down to concentrate its power, creating what was in effect medieval miracle grow. More fringe, still certain instructions advise separating male and female urine for different crops. Male urine for grain, female urine for herbs. Why unclear? Perhaps superstition. Perhaps based on vague observations. Or perhaps someone just wanted an excuse to micromanage every part of their family's morning routine. You stand there for a moment watching as a young man in patched hose carefully tips a fresh ladleful onto the base of a young plum tree. He whistles while he does it. No shame, no hesitation, just part of the rhythm of the day. Urine wasn't just applied directly either. It could be aged in clay jars, fermented for weeks until it became something between compost tea and liquid apocalypse. The smell, unspeakable. But the results, strangely impressive. Gardens fed with aged urine mixtures often produced bigger leaves, stronger stems, and more prolific yields. One Benedictine monk wrote, "Though the odor offendeth the harvest, rejoiceth." And it wasn't just for plants. Urine had other household uses too, including cleaning clothes. It was used as a pre-wash soak, softening leather, and even setting fabric dyes. One dyer's manual from 1462 includes the charming instruction, "Warm thy yarn in child's urine till it be tender as butter." Not a line you'll find in modern textile tutorials. The garden, of course, benefited most. Beets loved it. So did brassicas. Even hops used for brewing beer were said to climb more vigorously when soaked in chamber essence. You take a step back, half convinced you'll smell it now, but the breeze is kind tonight. Another odd little tradition. In some villages, garden borders were marked with urine, just a dash at the edge of the cabbage row or near the bean poles. It wasn't just about nutrients, it was boundary magic, a way of claiming the land, daring weeds, pests, and according to one belief, jealous neighbors to cross the line. There are stories, half folklore, half warning, of gardens ruined because someone else's urine was poured where it shouldn't be. One tale from Wales tells of a feud between two families that started when one man's morning blessing found its way into another man's onions. The harvest failed. The feud lasted 30 years. And yes, there was etiquette. You didn't just wander into someone's garden and contribute uninvited. Most homes kept their own urine barrel tucked near the outhouse or tucked discreetly behind the woodpile. Larger manors might even have communal buckets, each labeled for purpose. Laundry with Tanning's garden. You do not want to mix those up. You look again at the bucket by the gate. A sprig of rosemary hangs from its handle, perhaps to temper the odor, or perhaps as a sort of polite signal this one's in use. You step respectfully around it and continue on your way, trying not to think too hard about all the plants you just admired that may at one time have been bathed in this humble concoction. Above you, the sky is a pale navy, now just a smudge of stars beginning to peek through. The garden rests quietly, fed not just by soil and sun, but by every part of the household mind, heart, body, and bladder. You can't help it. You glance back at the bucket, then quickly away. You shake off the lingering image of the urine bucket, its rosemary sprig bobbing gently in the breeze like a badge of rustic pride. Moving on seems wise. So you follow a hedge-lined path that dips low, winding toward the far end of the garden, where the soil changes color, darker, loamier, and clearly well-rested. Nothing's growing here yet. The beds lie empty, but not abandoned. This is where the magic of crop rotation takes center stage. Not flashy, not fragrant, and certainly not sacred smelling like the compost heaps, but no less crucial. You're now standing in what the medievals would have called the fallow bed, a garden plot that's doing absolutely nothing, and that's exactly the point. Medieval gardeners understood something that took modern agriculture centuries to forget, and then relearned soil isn't just dirt, it's alive. And if you work it to death without giving it time to breathe, it gets tired, sour, and stubborn. So what did they do? They let it rest. They rotated their crops following loose but deeply embedded seasonal rhythms that dictated what grew where and when. The three-field system is the big one. Historians like to point to one field for autumn grains like rye or wheat, one for spring crops like peas or barley, and one left fallow. Each year the fields switched roles, but on a smaller scale in the humble garden behind a cottage or beside a monastery rotation was more intuitive. Peasants didn't consult charts, they consulted memory. Don't put onions where onions were, an old gardener might tell you. They gossip and don't like their own company. Funny, sure, but also accurate. Plants of the same family tend to drain the same nutrients from the soil. If you plant them in the same spot every year, your soil becomes tired of the conversation. Historians still argue whether these intuitive practices were handed down directly from Roman agricultural manuals or simply evolved through trial error and a great deal of cursing at disappointing turnips. Likely, it was both. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some gardens weren't just rotated yearly, but by lunar year. One bed would grow only root crops during odd years, leaf crops in even years, and be left to breathe every third. Whether it was superstition or savvy microbiology, the effect was impressive. Plants grew larger, soil stayed soft, and pests didn't have time to settle in. And fallow didn't always mean empty. Some beds were sown with green manures, quick-growing legumes like clover or vetch that fixed nitrogen in the soil. Others were topped with mulch and left to host weeds, then turned under in spring to enrich the soil. One clever practice involved laying old straw and even animal bedding across a fallow plot over winter. Come spring, it was turned into the earth, creating a thick, spongy base ready for whatever seeds you threw at it. More fringe. There were spiritual dimensions to soil rest too. Some believed the land needed a Sabbath, a holy nap. They might scatter bits of bread or dried herbs across the bed as offerings before leaving it untouched. A monk in 12th century York wrote that disturbing a resting bed before its time was like waking a dreaming beast. Dramatic, sure, but also kind of poetic. And while rest was vital, so was rotation logic. Heavy feeders like cabbage and squash followed nitrogen-fixing legumes like peas and beans. Light feeders like carrots and beets came next. Then maybe a fallow year or a blanket of wildflowers to soothe the earth. These weren't exact systems, but they worked. In some gardens, rotation patterns were scratched into wood and hung near the door, a kind of agricultural to-do list. In others, they were remembered only in rhyme. One particularly catchy one goes, "Beans for the first, wheat for the next, then let the earth lie and catch her breath." It may not win a poetry prize, but it helped feed entire families. Even monasteries followed rotation patterns, sometimes obsessively. Some abbeys tracked harvest data for decades, comparing yields and noting which saint's day produced the most bountiful radishes. Was it divine intervention or just good record keeping, you decide? You kneel now beside the fallow bed, running your fingers through the cool, untouched soil. It smells different, earthier, like a loaf of bread just before it's baked. A few volunteer plants have sprung up: tiny violets, wild mustard, a blade of barley someone must have dropped last harvest. It's peaceful here. No buzzing bees, no rustling stalks, just stillness, waiting. There's something deeply human about knowing when not to push, when to rest, when to let the earth be quiet for a season so that it can roar back later. And as you stand brushing the soil from your palms, you wonder how many gardeners ignored this rule, how many paid the price with stunted crops, sour cabbages, or angry saints. Probably more than a few, but those who listened, their gardens flourished year after year, quiet proof that sometimes the best thing you can do is nothing at all. You take one last look at the resting bed, dark, patient, and oddly dignified. A reminder that not every part of a garden must bloom to be alive. The quiet of the fallow bed lingers with you like an echo as you wander toward the far edge of the garden, where the air feels a little cooler and the soil softer underfoot. Here the plants grow a bit more freely tall, stalks waving, broad leaves swaying, and bright flowers dancing like gossiping townsfolk. But it's not the tomatoes or beans that catch your attention. It's the poppies and the dandelions and that long row of feathery-leaved fennel swaying like it's got secrets. You've entered the herbal high society, the realm of medieval plants that could feed you, heal you, or sometimes leave you giggling into your porridge. Welcome to the beds where dinner flirted with medicine and both occasionally dabbled in recreational chemistry. Take poppies, for instance. These were no mere decoration. The sap of the opium poppy, milky and bitter, was dried and steeped into a tea used to soothe pain-calm coughs and help children sleep. A few drops too many, though, and it might lull a grown man into the next world. The line between medicine and "you probably won't survive this" was blurry at best. Monasteries often cultivated poppies with extreme care, harvesting in silence, and recording each use in tidy Latin script. For the easing of suffering, one monk wrote delicately in the margins beside a drawing of a rather sleepy-looking fox. Historians still argue whether the use of opiate teas was widespread among peasants or confined to monastic and noble households. But references in folk songs and herb lore suggest it trickled down into village life, especially during harsh winters or childbirth. Want a quirky tidbit? Some believed poppies should only be harvested at dawn with bare feet, and only if you hadn't spoken since waking up. This ritual silence was thought to preserve the poppy's potency, and perhaps keep the spirits of sleep from becoming too possessive. Next up, dandelion wine. You've likely seen this golden elixir romanticized as some quaint countryside treat, but in medieval gardens it was one of the go-to beverages when other supplies ran dry. made by fermenting dandelion petals with honey or sugar, and often stored in clay jugs sealed with wax. It had a mild bite and an earthy sweetness, but it wasn't just for fun. Dandelion was considered a cleansing herb used to purify blood-settled digestion and provoke what one scribe delicately called a comfortable urination. Charming. Drink too much of it, though, and you might find yourself comfortably urinating for the next several hours. Further along the row, fennel, angelica, and valerian grow in elegant chaos. The fennel's licorice scent wafts upward, sharp and invigorating. This was the herb of clarity used to awaken the senses, sharpen the eyes, and ward off evil thoughts. Students might chew the seeds before reciting lessons. Monks nibbled them to stay alert during long vigils. Then there's valerian. Oh, sweet valerian. Earthy, pungent, almost dirty smelling. Not the most romantic of herbs, but a powerful sedative. Steeped in hot water and served before bed, it helped calm minds and slow racing hearts. One record from a Yorkshire abbey includes a handwritten dosage beside a drawing of a yawning badger. Badgers, it seems, were medieval shorthand for time to nap. Of course, not all these concoctions were safe. Some border on what we'd now call accidental psychedelia. A blend of poppy, meadow sweet, and mugwort could turn a fever dream into a full-blown vision quest. One French gardener claimed to have seen angels in his beans after drinking a midsummer cordial. He later recanted after his neighbor's goats went missing, and the truly fringe there was mandrake. You've heard the legends, the humanoid root that screams when pulled from the earth, killing the person who hears it. In reality, mandrake was real rare and genuinely powerful. Its roots did sometimes resemble tiny twisted bodies, and its alkaloids had intense effects: hallucinations, numbness, euphoria. Monks recorded its use in surgical anesthetics, love potions, and the occasional exorcism. To harvest it, gardeners would tie the root to a dog and coax it out of the soil from a safe distance. Why the dog? Because if the scream killed anything better the dog than the gardener. You wince imagining the poor creature tugging at a possessed carrot, howling into the night. In more modest gardens, hops were grown not just for brewing, but for stuffing pillows. Yes, hop pillows filled with the dried flowers believed to soothe headaches and bring restful sleep. A particularly fanciful recipe involved adding dried rose petals and a pinch of lavender for gentle dreams and no demons. If it smelled like medieval melatonin, it probably worked just as well. Even common herbs had secret powers. Sage to lengthen life, rue to ward off plague, mugwort for dreams. The garden wasn't just a pantry, it was a spell book in dirt. And every gardener had their own recipe, their own mix, their own story about the time their uncle drank too much of Aunt Edith's root stew and forgot his own name for 3 days. You walk slowly now through the herbal rows, the scent shifting with every step: anise, mint, camphor, cloves. It's dizzying, dreamy, and just a little dangerous. The kind of place where magic might feel real, where science was a whisper, and sleep was just a sip away. At the end of the row, an old woman dozes on a bench, a half-drunk mug of something fragrant cooling beside her. You don't disturb her. You just breathe in the mingled scents and wonder if she wakes up, will she remember her name? Or will she wake up in a dream? The scent of valerian and fennel lingers behind you like the aftertaste of a strange tea. Comforting, yes, but just slightly off-center. The garden darkens around the edges now, a velvet dusk settling in as the path narrows again, this time between two long beds bordered with neat stones. You step between stalks of celery and sprigs of parsley and almost miss the faint scent of garlic, until it hits you all at once. Welcome to the garlic border, part barrier, part guardian, part pungent promise of flavor to come. And here's where it gets clever. This isn't just a row of garlic because someone liked the taste. It's the medieval version of companion planting, a surprisingly sophisticated system where plants were chosen not just for their individual value, but for how they work together. Because in a time before synthetic fertilizers and bug sprays, peasants and monks had to rely on observation. If they noticed that beans grew better next to savory or that onions chased off moths, they remembered. If a cabbage failed after being planted beside sage, they remembered that too and probably swore about it in church. Garlic, it turns out, was the overachiever of the group. Not only did it repel aphids and beetles with its potent aroma, it also discouraged hungry animals and, according to some evil spirit, witches and nosy neighbors. That's right. Plant garlic around your garden's edge and you got a double defense system. Bugs turned away, and so did Cousin Ethel, who always wanted your leeks. Historians still argue whether companion planting was formal knowledge passed down in manuals or simply learned by doing, probably both. Some of the earliest agricultural writings describe plant pairings in cryptic poetic terms. The bean adores the savory, one line reads, but the onion quarrels with the pea. Sounds like gossip. Works like science. You crouch now between two well-paired rows, carrots and leeks. These two were a medieval dream team. Carrots drew pests that leeks repelled, and leeks lured bugs that carrots seemed to make sick. So instead of spraying or squashing gardeners, just teamed them up. Want a quirky tidbit? Some believe that planting basil next to rue would cause the basil to wither from rue's sharp tongue. It wasn't just biology, it was interpersonal drama with plants. There are entire garden journals from the 15th century written like matchmaking ledgers. Marjoram grows sweet beside thyme. Beans do well with cucumber if not too wet. And the planting combinations weren't all about pests. Some helped with growth. A cluster of chamomile could cheer up struggling cabbages. Borage was said to lift the hearts of strawberries. Whether this was due to soil chemistry or a contagious optimism, no one's quite sure, but it's adorable to imagine strawberries blushing under a borage's encouragement. Let's not overlook trap crops either. Medieval gardeners knew how to play the decoy game. They'd plant beds of nasturtiums or mustard far from the main rows to lure pests away. Some even grew sacrificial lettuce rows planted purely to be eaten by slugs so the good lettuce could thrive in peace. It's garden politics at its finest. And then there were the garlic guardians. A circle of garlic bulbs around the base of fruit trees. Not just for insects, but to anchor the tree's soul and keep rot at bay. Some monks whispered prayers as they planted each bulb, pressing a thumb into the soil and saying, "Stand watch." You wonder if it worked or if the tree just liked the company. More fringe still. There's record of a German gardener who swore by planting beans in the shape of a pentagram, surrounded by onions. He claimed it boosted yield and kept witches away. His neighbors just stopped making eye contact. But underneath the superstition is a very real, very practical truth. Plants help each other. Or they don't. And medieval gardeners learned those lessons the hard way, often by watching their parsnips wither, or their beets bolt under the bad influence of a neighboring herb. You wander farther down the path, spotting more classic combos: cabbage with dill, spinach beneath apple trees, peas, and mint, which might explain why the mint is staging a quiet coup over the entire row. Even in the corners of the garden where old crates and broken pots hold soil and sprouting shoots, you see the pairings. A tiny pot of lavender with rosemary. A terracotta bowl of marjoram nestled beside a proud stalk of sage. Accidental, maybe, but probably not. It's a garden of relationships, not just roots. Each plant placed not just for itself, but for what it can give. Shade scent protection flavor. It's quiet diplomacy and chlorophyll. You kneel and touch the soil beside a row of onions. Nearby, a cluster of strawberries look happy perhaps because of the onion's presence, or perhaps just because they're strawberries and don't need much to be pleased. You feel the earth crumbly warm and realize this patch isn't thriving by accident. This was planned, whispered, remembered, year after year, row after row, a partnership between human hands and leaf-fingered allies. Above you, the moon rises fully now, casting a soft silver light over the leafy alliances. The garlic glows faintly as if proud of its many accomplishments. You smile and try not to breathe too deeply. The path grows narrower, still curving past the garlic border and dipping toward a row of low-lying trellises where shadows fall in angled stripes across the ground. At first glance, it looks like a sleepy corner of the garden. But as your eyes adjust, you notice an intricate network of poles, twine-bent branches, and wooden stakes, all laced together like the bones of some sleeping creature. This is the realm of bean frames, pea tunnels, and twine trickery, a world where medieval gardeners didn't just plant up, they engineered it. You pause beneath an arch of bent hazel rods tied at the top with something that looks suspiciously like repurposed wool yarn. Climbing up one side are sweet peas in full bloom, their tendrils wrapping lovingly around the supports. On the other broad beans dangle like ornaments. It's functional, it's elegant, and it didn't require a single nail. Medieval gardeners knew the value of vertical space. When your garden's only the size of a cloak spread out on the ground, growing upward was a necessity, not an aesthetic choice. Trellises, lean-tos, pole frames, and tunnels made from bent saplings were all used to coax climbing crops into the air. Peas, beans, cucumbers, even gourds. Historians still argue whether these structures were based on Roman blueprints or local ingenuity. The evidence, well, most of it's gone. Wood rots, twine snaps, but we have drawings and manuscripts, scribbled garden plans, and a few surviving examples, tucked away in overly enthusiastic herbals. One English manuscript from the 15th century has a charming illustration of a woman cheerfully harvesting peas beneath what looks like an upside-down basket made from willow. Want a quirky tidbit? Some gardeners use spinning whorls, those little stone or bone discs, normally used for spinning wool, tied to the ends of their support strings. The extra weight helped keep the lines taut, and when the wind blew, they made a soft whirring noise that was said to confuse birds, and possibly neighbors. You walk under a string of old hemp twine stretched between two Y-shaped branches, where runner beans curl upward like green fire. Each tendril spirals with confidence, and you realize how little the plants care that there's no manufactured trellis here. All they need is a handhold, and medieval gardeners gave them plenty. There's a method here, of course. Poles were cut from hazel or willow because they were strong but flexible. Forked sticks were jammed into the earth at angles to create A-frames. A central spine might be tied with cords made from twisted nettle fiber. Not pretty, but durable. And all renewable next year, you just cut new poles and start again. Peas were often trained through tunnels, rows of hoops bent into the shape of an arched back and covered with thin branches, forming a shady walkway lined with pods. You can imagine children crawling through them, pretending to be knights or foxes, popping sweet peas in their mouths along the way. More fringe. In some abbeys, the trellises were arranged according to sacred geometry. Circles for eternity, triangles for the Trinity. One particularly poetic abbot insisted that cucumbers grew straighter when planted on a 5-point star frame. Did they? Probably not. But that didn't stop him from drawing it out in ink and sending copies to 3 other monasteries for their edification. And speaking of cucumbers, these were often nestled inside what were called pea cribs, half-barrel shapes formed from woven reeds or straw mats propped up like domes. They kept the sun off young shoots and encouraged vines to spiral around the structure like dancers climbing a spiral staircase. You pause to picture it, tiny green curls reaching skyward, wrapping around soft straw walls. Let's not forget twine trickery either. Medieval gardeners were masters of repurposing. Old wool flax threads, strips of linen, anything that could be twisted into cordage was fair game. One document even suggests using the hair from a comb to tie delicate shoots. That one's either creative or a bit concerning, but still you admire the commitment. There were also directional tricks. A string tied loosely between two sticks and rubbed with crushed garlic was said to guide beans in the right direction. Another method involved hanging tiny bells that chimed when tendrils touched them, believed to teach the plant how to climb. Whether the beans listened is unclear, but the image of a gardener congratulating a pea plant for good progress is oddly delightful. And the tools. Simple. A knife, a mallet, maybe a bit of beeswax to treat the cord ends. The real tool was observation, watching which side the wind favored, which way the sun angled at noon, which poles stood firm and which ones leaned like tired saints. As you walk along one particularly well-built trellis, a black cat darts beneath your feet and disappears into the bean tunnel. Somewhere a wooden frame creaks in the wind. A leaf brushes your cheek like a greeting. You duck through the next archway, following the twine path that glints faintly in the moonlight. This is gardening as architecture. A lattice work of intention, improvisation, and a little whispered magic. No nails, no blueprints. Just hand sticks and string arranged with the quiet confidence of someone who knows a 6-foot beanpole can feed a family for weeks. At the far end of the tunnel, a lone sunflower rises, tangled in the web of supports, its face turned toward the fading moonlight. You look up with it and wonder how something so simple ever seemed so small. You emerge from the pea tunnel as if waking from a green cathedral, blinking into the open stretch beyond. Here the air changes again. It's warmer not just from the day's heat, but from the strange stillness in the space around you. The walls are higher, tighter, and the garden feels almost protected. You've stepped into a walled garden, a feature most commonly found in monasteries and manor houses, where stone or brick walls didn't just mark territory, they shaped microclimates. You can feel it now. The air here holds onto warmth, like a cupped hand wrapping around the tomatoes and melons that grow in dense, leafy clusters against the southern wall. This was no accident. Medieval builders understood that enclosing a garden could trap heat-shelter delicate plants from biting winds and extend the growing season by weeks. Some walled gardens even had corner sun traps, nooks where rare or sensitive herbs were tucked in beside the masonry to soak up every ounce of solar generosity. Historians still argue whether this knowledge came from Moorish engineering, Roman horticulture manuals, or pure monastic experimentation. Likely it was all of the above. What's clear is that design influenced harvest. In a world without greenhouses or grow lights, the wall was technology. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some walls were built with bee bowls, little alcoves carved into the stone to house beehives. Not only did the bees pollinate the garden, but the warmth of the wall kept their honey production steady through fickle seasons. The bees got a luxury suite. The gardener got mead and cucumbers. You stroll along the southern edge now, running your hand along sun-warmed stone. Vines cling to the wall figs, perhaps, or a rogue bramble with swollen blackberries already nodding from their stems. Even in England, these fruits could be coaxed to thrive here, sheltered by the wall's embrace. Let's talk melons. Yes, melons. They were a medieval obsession among nobles and monks alike. Sweet exotic and absurdly delicate melons were a badge of horticultural honor. Growing them without the aid of a walled garden was nearly impossible north of the Alps. But give them a wall, a sun trap, and a bit of dung-heated compost, and they might just reward you with one small fragrant globe, usually eaten in tiny slices at feasts and followed by much boasting. Some walled gardens even included raised beds of stone or cold frames, simple glass-covered boxes used to start seedlings early. While true greenhouses were still a few centuries off, this was their spiritual ancestor. Cloistered monks laid glass panes salvaged from broken chapel windows over beds of lettuce and cress. They called it sunning the soil, more fringe. Some gardeners whispered that a walled garden had its own spirit, its own breath. There are accounts of monks speaking to the walls at sunrise, thanking them for their warmth. One abbey in Normandy even blessed its garden walls on Easter Monday, sprinkling holy water along the base and chanting verses meant for buildings, not plants. But here, everything was interconnected. Let's not forget color. Some walls were whitewashed not for decoration, but to reflect light back into the garden, bathing shaded corners in extra brightness. Others were painted with symbols, sunbursts, stars, crosses to encourage growth. Or maybe just to discourage boredom. You stop in front of an old pear tree trained flat against the wall, its branches tied gently to a lattice in perfect fan formation. This was called espalier, and it wasn't just pretty, it was practical. Trees grown like this took up less space, bore fruit earlier, and benefited from the radiant heat of the wall. Plus, they made perfect shade over a garden bench, and indeed, a bench sits beneath it now. Low stone, moss-flecked, slightly crooked. Someone has left a woven basket there half filled with rosemary and small yellow plums. You sit just for a moment and lean back against the wall. It's still warm from the sun. A subtle, steady warmth, not unlike the heat held in a loaf of bread pulled from an oven. You can see why they built these spaces. Not just for food, but for comfort. Sanctuary. Silence. A place where the chaos of the outside world was muffled by thick stone and leafy calm. Even the air feels different here. The breeze softens. The birds seem quieter. This was where the monk came to rest after tending the beans, where the lady of the manor walked before dusk brushing her fingers along the thyme, where the novice learned to prune roses in winter and harvest figs in spring. All of it bound in by 4 simple walls. And yet, it doesn't feel confined, it feels held. At your feet, a lizard scampers out from between 2 stones and disappears into the mint. The scent rises gently with its movement. Far above, a bell tolls. Vespers, perhaps. Time to return inside. But you sit just a moment longer, the wall steady behind your back, the scent of warm rosemary in the air, and a single ripe plum in your hand. Soft. Cool. Perfect. You rise from the stone bench, slowly still savoring the warmth, from the wall pressed gently against your spine. That single ripe plum gone. Sweet and tart with just a hint of sun-baked stone and garden dust. You wipe your fingers on your tunic and wander on. Around the next bend, the neat order of the walled garden gives way to something more chaotic: chickens. Not wild, not unruly, but not exactly penned in either. They're in motion, pecking industriously at the ground, weaving between patches of grass and beet greens. And what are they in? You blink. Is that a wheelbarrow? Not quite. It's more like a portable chicken coop built from wood straw and iron nails with small wheels crudely nailed to either side. The chickens shuffle along inside it, scratching the dirt below through a slatted floor. Welcome to the ingenious, slightly ridiculous world of mobile fertilizer machines. Yes, medieval gardeners were doing chicken tractors before it was trendy. This contraption pushed along once or twice a day by someone with calloused hands and a practical mind served multiple purposes. It gave chickens a fresh patch of bugs and weeds, it aerated the soil, and most importantly, it delivered droppings right where they were needed, no fork or shovel required. Just push, cluck, and fertilize. Historians still argue whether these devices were common or experimental, appearing only in monastic gardens and larger estates. But woodcut illustrations survive showing small wheeled coops being pulled by children or tethered goats. One monk in 1398 referred to his rolling hens as a blessing upon the barley bed. We'll take his word for it. Here's a quirky tidbit. Chickens were believed to be partial to music. Some gardeners played flutes or plucked strings near their mobile coops, believing it cheered the birds and made their manure more generous. Whether the chickens agreed is uncertain, but there's something delightful about picturing a medieval lad playing lute ballads to his poultry in the beetroot patch. Of course, chickens weren't just walking compost bins, they were pest control. Gardeners unleash them on slug-infested beds, trusting their beaks to find what hands missed. At night, the birds return to their main roosts, many built over compost piles to make the most of the heat generated by their own droppings. Efficient? Absolutely. Smelly, you bet. And they weren't alone. Ducks patrolled low-lying lettuces. Geese kept watch near fence lines, honking at anything suspicious, be it a fox or a nosy neighbor. In some manors, a small fowl rota was posted in the garden shed, noting who was in charge of what and which birds had permission to roam. More fringe? There were whispered tales of a goose named Marjorie who was trained to pull a small garden cart filled with compost tea. Whether she actually delivered it or simply knocked things over and honked a lot is unclear, but she was apparently popular enough to make it into 2 estate ledgers and 1 bad poem. Beyond fowl, some gardeners went further, piglets on leads. Goats in harnesses even trained ferrets used to chase out voles from underneath squash beds. The medieval garden was not a quiet place. It grunted, pecked, scratched, and occasionally squealed. Back to chickens. What they left behind was prized. Chicken manure is hot, high in nitrogen and must be composted or carefully managed. Hence the mobile coop, it spread smaller doses directly where needed. Some gardeners followed behind with a rake smoothing the soil. Others believed it was best to let the birds decide where the garden needed a boost. The hen knows the weary spot, one saying goes. You pause beside one of the contraptions now. 3 speckled hens strut within, eyeing you with mild suspicion. The wheels creak as a young boy leans into the frame and shoves it forward a foot or two. Behind them, the earth is scratched, fertilized, and for today done. There's something charmingly absurd about it all. No machines, no spreadsheets, just a child, a coop on wheels, and 3 birds with attitude providing tomorrow's pumpkin patch its nourishment. Let's not forget the chicken gifts either. Broken eggshells returned to the soil, feathers added to compost piles. Even the coop bedding straw soaked with droppings was raked into onion rows to give them a proper kick. Medieval gardeners wasted nothing. Every scrap, scratch, and squawk had a purpose. As you walk on, you hear a soft clucking behind you. One chicken hops down from the coop's edge and follows for a moment, then turns back toward her appointed patch. She knows her job. And maybe, just maybe, she knows she's appreciated. The chickens cluck their goodbyes behind you, fading into the rustle of the cabbage leaves and the low hum of evening insects. The garden at this point feels more like a living village than a plot of land. Every part has a task, a voice, even a little personality. You move toward a softer corner now, where the ground turns springy beneath your feet, and the air smells faintly of pine damp wool and moss. The rows here are less rigid. Nothing is growing up or in neat lines. Instead, this is a place of blankets and carpets of layers. Welcome to the medieval gardener's unsung hero mulch. And not just the straw or bark chips you might expect, but a wild, delightful mixture of moss bracken, dead leaves, wool scraps, and sometimes old clothing. Yes, really, because when you don't have access to synthetic weed barriers or store-bought soil conditioners, you get creative. You crouch beside a row of early onions, their green shoots poking through a matted layer of what looks like lichen and something suspiciously sheep-colored. A young woman nearby scatters more handfuls over the soil from a rough basket. It's raw fleece straight from shearing bits of grass and all. Historians still argue whether this use of wool scraps was practical experimentation or inherited folklore. Either way, we know they did it. Wool not only held in moisture but slowly released nitrogen as it decayed. Plus, it discouraged slugs who apparently hate crawling over lanolin-rich sheep fluff. Quirky tidbit. In some regions, people believed that wool from black sheep made the soil stronger than wool from white sheep. Others claimed moss gathered from north-facing trees was cooling and ideal for use beneath lettuces. The logic, unclear. The results apparently convincing enough to inspire many itchy, moss-laden garden beds. And bracken, that tall, feathery fern, was a favorite in damp climates. It dried easily, made a soft mulch, and was even bundled under cabbage to protect the leaves from splashback mud during rains. You can almost hear the squelch underfoot as the garden woman walks between rows bracken crunching softly beneath her clogs. Dead leaves were also collected in sacks come autumn, stored in corners or under hay, and applied generously in early spring. Layered thickly, they discouraged weeds and warmed the soil. Some gardeners mixed them with wood ash for extra minerals. Others burned them slightly first, believing smoked mulch discouraged root rot. That's a bold move, one spark too many, and your mulch becomes a bonfire. And then there's cloth mulch. Yes, literal cloth. Torn tunics, worn-out undergarments, and linen that had outlived its decency were laid carefully over rows and pegged down with sticks. Not for aesthetics, certainly, but to shade out weeds, hold in heat, and prevent soil crusting. A medieval version of landscape fabric, but with more holes in the occasional family crest. More fringe still. Some gardeners sang to their mulch piles, or more accurately to the worms and beetles living underneath. One documented tradition from the Low Countries involved gently drumming on the compost heap in rhythm. Boom, 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 to wake the life within. Whether it worked or simply startled a few mice is anyone's guess. Let's not overlook the mulch layering system either. In wealthier households, gardeners constructed seasonal mulch layers base of straw, topped with wool in winter, moss and leaves in spring, fern in summer to reflect light and keep roots cool. It was like dressing the garden in seasonal outfits. Practical and kind of adorable. And in monasteries there were mulch recipes. One manual from 1471 lists precise instructions. 2 parts straw, 1 part wool, a sprinkle of soot, and a prayer. You wonder if the prayer was for the plants or for whoever had to handle the moldy wool. You lean down now and lift a corner of mulch, just enough to see the dark, spongy soil beneath. It's moist, alive. A small earthworm wriggles deeper, not thrilled to be disturbed. You smile. This is where the garden breathes. Not up in the flowers or vines, but down here in the rot, the fluff, the crumble of last year's coat. Even in cities, people mulched. Kitchen waste covered with moss. Broken rushes swept from the floor, reused in window boxes. In one Parisian market, a butcher's wife was fined for hoarding floor hay for her onion pots. Scarcity breeds ingenuity. You hear the soft rustle of leaves as someone nearby spreads a fresh layer of bracken over a bed of young squash. The air grows damper with evening, and the mulch begins to steam gently under the touch of dew, a quiet comforter for tired soil. This, you realize, isn't just about keeping weeds down, it's a gesture of care. A blanket tucked in at night, a hand on the earth's shoulder saying, "Rest, grow, I've got you covered." You rise brushing moss from your palm and continue on warmer somehow, not from the mulch itself, but from the thought behind it. The garden sleeps beneath its patchwork quilt, and tomorrow it will rise stronger. The garden seems to hush around you now. The birds have quieted. The breeze has softened. You walk slower as if the space itself has decided it's time to dim the lights. But something curious reaches your ears, not silence exactly, but faint, irregular sounds. A soft tinkling here, a distant chime there. You turn a corner and find yourself in the sounding section of the garden. That's right, you've heard of color gardens, scent gardens, even moon gardens. But medieval gardeners had something better garden music. Not from musicians, but from bells rattles and hanging tokens, meant to do double duty, chase pests and soothe the soul. Above you, strung between two bent willow poles, a row of tiny metal discs tinkle as they sway in the air. Old coins, maybe. Spoons. Bits of flattened iron with holes punched through. They're dancing in the breeze, singing a tune that's not quite a melody, but not far off. It wasn't just decoration, it was pest deterrent. Crows, mice, and even deer were believed to be unsettled by unpredictable sound. And the early gardeners took full advantage. Chimes made of pottery shards, broken bronze copper wire, even animal bones were suspended over crops. You squint upward now at a small bundle of scallop shells clicking gently together like a nervous prayer. Historians still argue whether the practice came from folk tradition or imported Eastern garden designs where bells were hung to calm spirits. But in medieval Europe, the result was a strangely symphonic garden defense system, equal parts scarecrow wind chime and ambient ASMR. Want a quirky tidbit? Some gardeners swore by using pig jaw bones as clappers. Hung by leather straps, they made a clacking hollow sound that was supposed to startle voles. There's even a monk in Bavaria who built a rat organ, a grid of bone tubes that made notes when wind passed through. Whether it worked on the rodents is unknown. Whether it haunted the dreams of nearby villagers, almost certainly. But not all garden music was about fear. Some of it was for the gardener. One marginal note from a 14th century herbal reads, "Sing when thou sowest for the root, here's best." And they did. Many peasants hummed while digging, muttered rhymes while planting, or whistled as they weeded. Children were often given rattles, not just to amuse themselves, but to scare away birds while they sat near vulnerable seedlings. One French account suggests that particularly melodic children were in high demand during cabbage season. Whether the cabbages enjoyed the concerts is sadly undocumented. Monks, of course, added their own spin. In some cloisters, tiny bells were blessed and hung in gardens not to repel pests but to invite peace. The sound they believed kept the space pure, chasing away not insects but impure thoughts. Some chanted while tying vines, their voices blending with the bell tones into a meditative drone. You pause now beside a rough wooden structure that looks like a gate with no fence, just a frame covered in hanging things. Feathers, stones, bits of glass, all strung on twine and spaced unevenly. When the wind gusts, they clack and hum and ring in chaotic harmony. You listen. It's oddly hypnotic. You can imagine spending hours here just watching the sound. And then you notice a more deliberate rhythm, a set of clay pipes hung vertically beside the squash bed. each one slightly different in size. Someone has placed pebbles inside so when the wind blows, they rattle like gentle rain. Gardeners believe this kept certain beetles from settling. Others just like the sound. More fringe. There's mention in a Scottish gardening almanac of a man who taught his birds to whistle tunes to keep slugs away. Was it true? Unclear. But it also advises hanging garlic on your ears while transplanting lettuce, so either way, it's a delightful read. Let's not forget the silence, too. Some gardeners insisted that certain plants, particularly medicinal herbs, preferred quiet. They built sound walls of straw or willow hurdles to shield plants from wind and noise. In one monastic garden, yarrow and rue were kept in the hush corner, a place where no tools were allowed and no voices were raised, just bees and breath. You find yourself in such a corner now. A soft patch of thyme and sweet woodruff underfoot. Overhead, a thin bell swings on a wire too high to touch. Its clapper is a stone. It doesn't ring unless the wind really wants it to. You stand beneath it for a long moment waiting. Nothing. And then just as you exhale, it tings. One clear high note. A perfect solitary ping. You smile and keep walking. Because this garden doesn't just grow, it listens. It sings. And sometimes it answers. The sound of the bell lingers in your ears like a dream half remembered. You leave the hush corner slowly, almost reluctantly drawn toward a part of the garden that looks sculpted, trimmed, intentional. The chaos of pea tunnels and bracken mulch fades behind you, replaced by rows of tidy hedges clipped into curious shapes. Spheres, pyramids, even a very confident-looking snail. Welcome to the world of topiary medieval gardening's boldest and most philosophical flourish. Here function takes a step back, and form comes marching proudly forward, shears in hand. And though we often associate trimmed hedges with Renaissance pomp, topiary has medieval roots as tangled and quirky as the shapes themselves. You stop in front of a low yew hedge cut into the form of a lion. It's a bit lopsided, and its mane looks more like a series of leafy lumps than ferocious tufts, but still you can tell what it wants to be. And that was the point. These weren't just decorations. They were symbols, messages etched in green. In monastic gardens, shapes held mystical meaning. A sphere represented divine perfection, a spiral the path of prayer. Some monks clipped their hedges into crosses, doves, or stylized flames to mirror spiritual concept in the living world. One manuscript even describes a hedge maze clipped into the shape of a ladder, each tier representing steps toward enlightenment. Or maybe just a really determined gardener. Historians still argue whether medieval topiary was a local evolution or borrowed from Roman horticultural tradition, revived from dusty manuscripts and reinterpreted by monks with too much time and too many shears. Either way, by the 14th century, shaping shrubs was a thing, especially in the gardens of the devout and the wealthy. Want a quirky tidbit? Some gardeners trained rosemary and lavender into tiny animal shapes using wicker molds. One particularly ambitious herbalist claimed to have grown a lavender unicorn over 5 years. It later collapsed in a rainstorm, but she kept the stump as a relic. More fringed topiary was sometimes used as a language. A bird might mean freedom. A coiled serpent might be a warning. One documented case from a monastery in Avignon mentions a dispute between two monks over the shape of a yew hedge. One believed it was a dove. The other insisted it was a devil. They resolved the matter with prayer and pruning. And it wasn't just animals. Some topiary represented the seasons. A clipped orb for the sun. A flat square for winter's stillness. Gardeners created living calendars walking through a hedge-lined timeline with each month represented by a shape, a color, or a bloom. You walk now along a path flanked by low hedges, shaped into wave patterns mimicking the sea. At the end is a bush that looks vaguely like a ship, or maybe a whale, it's hard to say. You imagine a medieval child darting around it, pretending to sail to Jerusalem or chase pirates through the hedgerows. Let's not forget the maintenance involved. These weren't casual projects. Gardeners used hand shears, small, heavy, and often homemade. Trimming a single yew spiral could take hours, and yew, by the way, is toxic. So many a gardener ended their shift with numb fingers, red eyes, and a vague sense of vertigo. Still, they trimmed. In noble households, topiary competitions were not unheard of. Gardeners would boast of how fine their goose looked, or how precisely their knot garden formed the family crest. In one estate ledger, a payment is recorded to Thomas of Norwich for the hedging of a hawk most cunningly shaped. No one recorded how long it lasted, probably until the next frost. But topiary wasn't always grand. In cottage gardens, small boxwood bushes were trimmed into hearts or simple spirals, acts of quiet pride. A clipped shrub by the front gate said, "I have time to tend. I care for beauty." In a world where survival often took precedence that meant something, you stop before a tiny shrub that's clearly been coaxed into the shape of a bird. Its wings are asymmetrical. Its beak is more of a snub. But it's perched there proud. Someone tried. Someone shaped it. And someone still trims it year after year. The sun is low now, casting long shadows across the clipped shapes, turning the hedges into silhouettes. It's strange, somehow more alive this way. The lion looks more lionish. The snail gains mystery. The whale becomes myth. You reach out and brush a hand over the surface of a square hedge. The texture is soft, pliant, surprisingly precise. A few trimmed bits fall like confetti to the ground. And as you turn to leave this green gallery of symbols and leafy metaphors, you catch sight of a very tall, very awkward bush that seems to have been halfway through becoming a knight before the gardener gave up. It leans a little, its sword arm droops, its helmet is definitely lopsided, but still it stands. The leafy knight stands vigil behind you as you pass into the dimmer edge of the garden, where the air feels cooler again, but not because of shade or breeze. This place is quieter in a different way, like no one comes here often. The path narrows. Ivy creeps along the low stones, and for a moment you think you've taken a wrong turn. Then you spot it, a tangle of wildflowers growing from a bed of disturbed earth, a broken trowel half buried nearby, and just beyond it a small unmarked mound of soil, not raised like a compost pile, not sunken like a planting bed. You stop. You already know what it is. This is where gardening brushed up against the edge of superstition and mortality. This is where some medieval gardeners came to collect grave dirt. Yes, actual dirt from actual graves, collected quietly often at night, and depending on who you asked, used either as the ultimate fertilizer or as a charm, a talisman mixed into garden beds for luck, strength, or protection. It sounds morbid now, maybe even outrageous. But in an age where life and death intertwined daily, the idea that death could feed life wasn't as shocking as you might think. Historians still argue whether that was widespread practice or fringe folklore. But references pop up in enough herbals letters and legal complaints to suggest it wasn't unheard of. One 14th century gardener in Essex was fined for removing earth from the churchyard and placing it in his bean trench. He claimed it was holy ground made strong by saints. The local priest did not agree. Quirky tidbit. Some believe that dirt from a grave no older than 7 days had the most potency, especially if it came from someone righteous untangled by sin. Others preferred earth from the feet of the dead where their journey began. One text explains, There are even records of people stealing dirt from under the feet of saint statues, believing it was infused with divine vitality. But not all uses were so eerie. Grave dirt, especially from the resting places of loved ones, was sometimes added to garden corners as a memorial, not a fertilizer. A handful of earth beneath a rose bush, a scoop beneath a favorite tree. To plant, they believed, was to remember, and the memory would bloom year after year. More fringe still. Some medieval midwives believed that herbs grown in grave dirt-enriched soil had special healing powers, particularly for childbirth and fevers. Mugwort, sage, and comfrey were frequent suspects. One midwife in Avignon reportedly tended a garden fed entirely with earth from virgins' graves, a phrase that raises far more questions than it answers. Of course there were dangers. Superstition ran both ways. Some believed that using grave dirt cursed the garden, attracting restless spirits, or causing crops to sprout in the shape of skulls. One ballad tells of a man whose leeks grew in rows like teeth, a sure sign he'd offended someone in the churchyard. You kneel beside the mound now, brushing a hand across the soil. It's indistinguishable from any other patch of earth. Dark, loamy crumbling under your fingers. Nothing supernatural leaps out, but still you feel something. Not a ghost, not a curse, just a heaviness. The kind that clings to places where stories have settled. And nearby, almost as a counterpoint, a patch of foxgloves bloom, tall and defiant. Poisonous, beautiful, and historically used to treat heart conditions. Their very presence a reminder that life and death often shared the same route. You walk on and the path opens slightly. Ahead is a small grove of elder trees, their branches arching low. Beneath them, a scattering of wild herbs grows freely. Nettles, mugwort, plantain, maybe planted, maybe not. You can't quite tell. This was the wild corner found in many older gardens, a place left untamed, partly for nature, partly for spirits, and partly because, well, sometimes it's good to leave a few things alone. You pass a flat stone half buried in moss. Faint carvings trace the outline of a spiral, maybe a symbol, maybe just the idle work of someone who once sat here thinking. Either way, you feel something shift. Not ominous, not frightening, just weighty, as if the soil remembers, because the garden was never just about carrots and cabbages. It was a cycle, a story, a burial, and a blooming all at once. Seeds went down, life came up, and everything returned to the earth eventually, including you. You leave the wild corner with a gentler step, glancing back once toward the spiral-marked stone and the foxglove patch still standing tall in the hush. The path you follow now narrows, winding between stacks of firewood and a low stone wall dappled with moss. A wooden door creaks ahead, low, heavy, and not quite garden-sized. You duck beneath the lintel and step into a dim, vaulted space where the air feels cold and perfectly still. This is not a place of growing things. This is where seeds sleep. Welcome to the medieval seed vault. Or rather, its earlier, humbler cousin, the storage cellar crypt scroll tube, or hidden cupboard tucked away in monasteries and manor houses. Because long before Svalbard built its icy fortresses of global seed protection, medieval gardeners had their own quiet ways of preserving the future. The shelves in here are rough-cut wood, damp at the corners, but dry enough where it counts. Lined along them are tiny cloth bags, hollow bones, rolled parchment tubes, and small glazed pots, each one sealed with wax cork or string. And inside, treasure, peas, wheat, poppy, barley, beans the color of polished stone, flax seeds like gold dust. All of them waiting dormant, preserved not just for planting, but for memory. Historians still argue whether these early collections were methodical archives or simply habit. Some were undoubtedly practical, keeping extra seed for next year's planting. But others were more symbolic seeds kept from a grandmother's garden, or from a harvest that followed a plague, or from a vine that only ever yielded one perfect melon. Kept not just because they grew, but because they mattered. Want a quirky tidbit? In certain monasteries, the most valuable seeds were stored in ink scroll cases, the same tubes used to protect sacred scripture. One even bore the inscription God's Word and God's Seed, both worth saving. And yes, there was record keeping. In some gardens, a seed book was kept scratched into vellum or even wood planks, where gardeners recorded when the seeds were gathered from which plant and under what moon or weather. One entry reads broad beans, stout and green from the last full moon before the frost, planted well by candle. In poorer homes, seeds were stored in cloth packets tucked between thatch rafters or in the back of the bread oven when cold, of course. Others tied seed bundles in scraps of wool and hung them in clay jars from the ceiling where mice couldn't reach. You see one of those jars now still dangling. Inside, a handful of dried pea pods rattle softly with each step you take. More fringe. There's mention of blessed seed grains sprinkled with holy water and stored in carved boxes shaped like small churches. These were only planted in years of desperate need, not for yield, but for faith. Some believed they could summon better weather. Others simply felt better knowing they had one last miracle tucked away in the cupboard. And for those who couldn't write or draw maps, seeds were marked by texture and scent. Rubbing a fennel seed between thumb and forefinger, rolling wheat to feel the grain, smelling dried rosemary to check for freshness. Knowledge passed hand to hand, garden to garden. You step deeper into the vault and notice a row of bones, clean, smooth, hollow. Bird bones, fox bones, even small antlers. Each one had been sealed with wax at both ends. Inside seeds, the ultimate recycling. One gardener wrote, "Bone knows to keep what lives." You pause unsure whether that's comforting or unsettling. Let's not forget what wasn't kept. Some seeds were buried, literally, as offerings or as a promise. There are records of peasants planting a single kernel of wheat at the crossroads after a poor harvest, hoping the next year would yield better. Others sowed ghost plots, rows of beans never meant to sprout, only to remember those lost before spring. And then there were traded seeds, carried in pouches exchanged between strangers at markets wrapped in linen and handed off like secrets. Some bore notes, others bore nothing but a smile. Entire regional varieties of barley, of flax, of kale began this way: shared, pocketed, planted elsewhere. The medieval seed vault wasn't always a vault. Sometimes it was a person. You reach the back wall now, where a carved wooden box rests beneath a small slit of light. Inside it, 10 clay pellets marked with crude symbols. You lift one, it's heavier than expected. You crack it open. Inside, 4 tiny seeds, wrapped in dried rose petals. Who planted them you'll never know, but someone thought they were worth saving, worth tucking into clay and sealing away, for a spring that may or may not come. You stand for a moment longer in the stillness, listening. Even here the garden is present, silent, dreaming. Above you hear a bell ring, faintly in the distance. Morning prayers. Time to return. But as you step out of the vault, the tiniest wind picks up, rustling your cloak, whispering over your shoulder like breath on the back of your neck. The seeds wait, and so will you. You emerge from the seed vault like someone waking from deep, pleasant sleep, your eyes adjusting, your ears reacquainting themselves with sound. The garden greets you softly. There's dew in the air and a hush that's not silence but reverence. A final stretch of path lies ahead. It's narrower now, less orderly. More memory than function. The stones beneath your feet are crooked. The herbs lean where they please. The fruit trees here aren't perfectly pruned anymore, and the bean poles are slightly tilted moss, softening their spines. But this is where the soul of the medieval garden lives on. Because in the end, the garden was never just food, never just medicine. It was legacy in the loam, a quiet earth and time capsule of every hand that touched it. You pass an old apple tree now, its trunk twisted bark flaking like old parchment. But from one of its crooked branches hangs a small wooden tag, the lettering, long since worn away. Someone named this tree, maybe after a daughter, or a saint, or a good harvest, and someone still perhaps bites into the apples from it each year and remembers something. Historians still argue whether medieval gardens were truly planned spaces or organic accumulations over generations. But either way, they became archives, physical stories, beds built by grandmothers, fences mended by uncles. The first fig from a foreign seed tucked lovingly behind a shed. A rosemary bush that outlived the house that planted it. Quirky tidbit. Some people buried charms beneath new garden beds. A coin, a lock of hair, a written prayer. Not for the plant's sake, but to tie their memory to the soil. It wasn't uncommon to find layers beneath layers, each generation planting over the last like a living palimpsest. You step over one now, an uneven square of stone with a faint engraving. It looks like a scallion or a tulip, or maybe just a flourish. Either way, someone carved it, knelt over it, tucked it into the dirt, and left it there. And then there are the forgotten corners. Every garden had them. Places where no one planted anymore, but where things grew anyway. Goosefoot, violets, wormwood. Sometimes people whispered that these spots were planted by the dead. Not ominous, just respected. Left alone. Watched. One particularly poetic monk described his garden as a scroll of silence. Each leaf a word, each furrow a sentence, the whole thing written by seasons and time and hands no longer here. He tended it not to harvest, but to remember. You can feel that now. Even the birds sound more nostalgic here. A thrush sings 3 perfect notes and then goes quiet again. Somewhere water trickles. The air smells of sage and damp stone and smoke from a distant chimney. You pause beside a crumbling wall where someone has stacked old tools' handles, worn smooth by years of use. A hoe, a trowel, a short-handled rake with one missing tine. You run a hand along the wood and feel the indentations of fingers that pressed here long before yours. There are still things growing, late squash curling across a path, a pot of chives blooming purple, a few stubborn leeks pushing up through the cold soil. The kind of plants that don't care how long it's been. They just keep going. More fringe. There were tales that a gardener's soul stayed in the last place they sowed a seed. That if you listen closely near twilight, you might hear them walking. Not haunting, just checking the mulch. And maybe it's true. Maybe that's the sound you hear now, not wind, not birdsong, but footsteps. Slow, steady, familiar. Yours. Because after all you've seen, you're not just walking through this garden. You are part of it. The compost piles. The pea tunnels. The chickens in their rolling cages. The moonlit calendars, the garlic barriers, the whispering monks. The rags turned mulch. The bells and bones and jars of dreaming seeds. You're in all of it now. And when you walk away, when you leave the garden and return to wherever you came from, something lingers. In your mind, in your breath, maybe even under your fingernails. Because the medieval garden was never just dirt and dung and vegetables. It was memory. It was meaning. It was home. And now with the garden resting behind us, its paths soft with moss, its borders silvered by moonlight, we let the story fade gently into sleep. The compost still steams quietly in the corner, its heat humming beneath the surface. The rosemary bush near the gate leans slightly in the breeze. Somewhere beyond the hedges, a bell tolls its last note of the night, then falls into silence. You imagine the seeds still sealed in their bone tubes tucked in cool corners, the garlic still holding its line around the strawberry patch, the straw-wrapped bean poles nodding gently with the weight of the stars above them. Everything is still alive, just quieter now. The garden doesn't sleep like we do. It rests in layers, in breathless stillness, in the weight of the soil folding softly over itself, waiting, listening. And you, tucked beneath your own quilt of blankets, hold on to just a few scraps of memory. The scent of time crushed underfoot, the creak of a wooden trellis in the wind, the feel of warm sun against a stone wall. Maybe tomorrow you'll dream of turnips planted by moonlight, of poppies blooming beside whispering monks, of chickens pushing tiny wheelbarrows. Or maybe you'll simply sleep. That's fine too. You've walked enough tonight. So let the mulch settle. Let the tools rest. Let the soil go still. I'll be here with another story for you tomorrow night.